England, 1659. No king, no throne, no one sitting at the top of the most powerful monarchy in Europe, because the most powerful monarchy in Europe had cut off its own head 10 years ago and was still trying to figure out what to do with the body. Parliament was governing, except Parliament had dissolved itself, except then it reconvened, except then the army dissolved it again, except then a different Parliament sat, except then that one collapsed too. 3 governments in 12 months. The country was not on fire. It was something worse than that. It was a place where no one could agree on what the rules were, which meant the rules were whatever the nearest armed man said they were. And England had a lot of armed men. Every general had a faction. Every faction had a pamphlet. Every pamphlet had a vision for what England should become. The noise was enormous. The noise was constant. The noise had been going on since 1649, and it showed absolutely no sign of stopping. Except in one place. In Scotland, at the garrison town of Dalkeith, a regiment drilled at dawn. Same time as yesterday, same formation, same pay, distributed on the same day it was promised down to the last shilling. No pamphlet, no faction, no declaration. Just a regiment that showed up. That regiment would become the Coldstream Guards, the oldest continuously serving regiment in the British Army, the foundation stone of every royal guard that followed, the institutional spine of a monarchy that should, by every measure of political logic, have stayed dead. But before we show you the exact morning that changed everything, before the king landed at Dover, before the letters went out, before the ceremony and the crowns and the portraits, there is a man standing in a cold Scottish courtyard watching his soldiers drill and saying absolutely nothing. That silence is the whole story. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Then tap like, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell icon. Because today isn't about kings or crowns. It's about what happens when every powerful man in England is making speeches and one soldier simply refuses to. The marble certainty of English power had cracked in 1649. That was the year they put Charles I on trial, found him guilty of treason against his own people, and took his head off outside the banqueting house at Whitehall on a January morning cold enough that witnesses later said his breath was still visible when he knelt. The republic that followed was called the Commonwealth. It was run by Parliament and, increasingly, by the army that had won the Civil War. The new model army, possibly the most formidable fighting force England had ever produced, and now a political actor with opinions, grievances, and enough weapons to make both count. Oliver Cromwell held it together. Not elegantly, not democratically, not without contradiction, but he held it. He became Lord Protector in 1653, which was a title specifically invented to avoid the word king while doing everything a king does. He ruled until 1658. He died in September of that year, leaving power to his son Richard. Richard Cromwell lasted 8 months. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man handed a burning building and told it was a house. He resigned in May 1659. The army, now running without a strong hand above it, reinstated the leftover remnant of the old Parliament, the Rump Parliament, so called because it was what remained after the more moderate members had been purged a decade earlier. The Rump tried to govern. The army didn't like how that was going. In October 1659, General John Lambert, the most powerful military figure in England after Cromwell's death, dissolved the Rump Parliament by the simple method of surrounding it with soldiers and sending the members home. He then set up a Committee of Safety, which was a name for military rule wearing civilian clothes. Lambert was brilliant. Lambert was ambitious. Lambert was, by the autumn of 1659, the most dangerous man in England. And Lambert had no idea what was coming from Scotland. George Monk was 51 years old in 1659. He had fought for the king in the early Civil War, been captured, switched sides, fought for Parliament, been given command of Scotland after the Royalists were defeated there, and had run the Scottish occupation with a precision and fairness that was remarkable enough to be unusual. He was not an ideologue. That is the first thing to understand about him, and it is the thing almost every faction in England got wrong about him. They looked at him and tried to locate his ambition, the thing he wanted, the cause he served, the vision he had for England's future. They sent messengers, they sent letters, they sent promises. He accepted the letters, he fed the messengers, he wrote back almost nothing of substance. Because George Monk did not have a vision for England's future, George Monk had a regiment. And his regiment was his answer to every question anyone could possibly ask him. While Lambert was dissolving parliaments in London, while royalist agents in France were mapping out Monk's presumed weaknesses, while Presbyterian ministers were writing him sermons disguised as political advice, Monk was in Dalkeith doing the same thing he had been doing for years. Paying his men on time, running drill at dawn, keeping the ledger balanced. His regiment had not mutinied. In a country where armies were rewriting their own orders on a weekly basis, where soldiers were petitioning Parliament, where officers were signing declarations and forming factions, Monk's men showed up, drilled, ate, slept, and showed up again. The pay ledger from this period still exists in the National Archives. Every entry is clean, every payment logged, every name accounted for. It is the most quietly extraordinary document of the entire crisis. While England tore itself apart over who should govern, one regiment had simply stayed employed, and the man running that regiment had stayed quiet. The quiet was not passivity. The quiet was a position. January 1, 1660. Monk's army crossed the River Tweed from Scotland into England. He had not announced why. He had not declared for any faction. He had not responded to Lambert's entreaties to join the Committee of Safety. He had not responded to the royalist agents who had been sending letters from Charles II's court in exile. He had not declared for the old Parliament or the new one, or the one that had been dissolved, or the concept of Parliament as an institution. He had simply started marching south. The effect on English politics was immediate and total. Lambert marched north to intercept him with an army. Lambert's army, unpaid, unfed, politically confused about what it was even fighting for, began deserting the moment it left London. By the time Lambert's force reached the Midlands, it had lost so many men that confronting Monk's disciplined, paid, loyal regiment was no longer a serious military option. Lambert turned back. He didn't fight. There was nothing left to fight with. Monk kept marching. The letters intensified. Republican hardliners wrote to him insisting he come to restore the Commonwealth in its pure form. Presbyterian MPs wrote to him asking him to support a constitutional settlement with conditions on royal power. Royalist agents wrote to him with promises of lands and titles if he declared for the king. He answered them all with the same courteous, substantive, completely noncommittal language that gave each side exactly enough encouragement to keep writing without committing him to anything. It was the most sophisticated political performance of the century, executed by a man who never once called it politics. His army marched, clean, paid, disciplined. The silence held. Monk entered London on February 3, 1660. The city received him warily. London had lived through enough entrances by enough generals to know that military arrival usually preceded something unpleasant. The shops stayed cautiously open. The streets were full but not festive. Parliament, the Rump, restored again after Lambert's collapse, was technically in session. They needed Monk. They also feared him. The two feelings competed in every message they sent. Then they made a decision that would prove to be the last serious error of the English Republic. They ordered Monk to enforce their authority over the city of London. the old walled medieval heart of the city, governed by its own aldermen, resistant to the Rump's control. Specifically, they ordered him to arrest 11 leading aldermen, dismantle the city gates, and remove the chains that had been strung across the streets as barriers. Monk did it. He marched his regiment into the city and followed the order to the letter. The city went dark. Not metaphorically, literally. The citizens of London extinguished their lights in protest, a rolling blackout of candles and torches that moved through the streets ward by ward until the city sat in unusual darkness for a February evening. The bonfires that Londoners traditionally lit to celebrate a government they supported, there were none. In their place, in the courtyards and the alleys just beyond the reach of Monk's soldiers, Londoners were roasting rumps of beef. The message was not subtle. They were cooking the Rump Parliament over open fire. They did it cheerfully. The smell of it drifted through the cold streets all night. Monk stood in the city and looked at what he had done. He had followed the order. He had done exactly what a soldier was supposed to do when Parliament issued a directive. He had been correct procedurally. He had also just broken something. He could feel it. The discipline that had held his regiment together through 3 years of Scottish occupation, through a march of 300 miles, through the political chaos of the previous 4 months, that discipline was based on a premise. The premise was that legitimate authority was worth obeying. And standing in the dark city of London, smelling roasting beef, watching citizens protest with their candles and their meat and their complete absence of fear, Monk confronted the possibility that the authority he had just enforced was not legitimate. It had the name of Parliament. It did not have the consent of the people it governed. He went back to his quarters. He did not sleep. The letter went out on February 21, 1660. It was addressed to the Rump Parliament. It was written in Monk's characteristic style, clear, undecorated, precise. It did not raise its voice. It informed the Rump that unless they took immediate steps to fill the empty seats in Parliament with the members who had been excluded, the moderate Presbyterians and others purged over the previous decade, Monk would no longer be able to guarantee the security of their government. He did not say he would march against them. He did not say he supported the king. He said he could not guarantee their security. The Rump understood what it meant. The whole of London understood what it meant. The whole of England, reading the news sheets that printed the letter within days, understood what it meant. Monk had just handed Parliament a shovel and told them to start digging. The excluded members were readmitted on February 21st. The reconstituted Parliament voted to dissolve itself on March 16th. New elections were called. The new Parliament, called the Convention Parliament because it had convened without royal authority, which was the one piece of formality that still made some people nervous, met in April. On May 1, 1660, the Convention Parliament voted to restore the monarchy. Charles II, who had been living in genteel exile in the Spanish Netherlands, received the news at Breda. He wrote a letter, the Declaration of Breda, offering general amnesty, religious tolerance, and a settlement of property disputes, all subject to parliamentary approval. It was, by the standards of the correspondence England had been generating for 11 years, a remarkably concise document. Charles had learned something from the silence. He landed at Dover on May 25, 1660. General Monk was there to meet him. He knelt. Charles raised him. By most accounts, the king said something warm and Monk said something brief. The exact words were not recorded with consistency across sources, which feels appropriate. The crowd was enormous. The celebrations in London lasted days. There were bonfires everywhere, real ones now, celebratory ones, and the bells of every church in the city rang until the ringers had nothing left. The Republic was over. The king was back. 11 years of constitutional experiment, civil war, military rule, and ideological exhaustion had resolved into a man in good clothes stepping off a boat at Dover, while a general who never declared his intentions knelt in the sand. It looked like a ceremony. It was actually a transaction. And in the days that followed, as Charles moved through Canterbury and Rochester toward London, as the city prepared for his formal entry and the court began its resurrection, Monk had a conversation with the king that history has recorded only in outline. He did not ask for the earldom first, though he would receive it. He did not ask for the generalship of the army first, though he would receive that too. He asked for his regiment. Specifically, he asked that his regiment, the one that had marched from Scotland, the one with the clean pay ledger, the one that had drilled at dawn through the entire collapse of the English Republic, be kept intact, paid, and made permanent. Not disbanded, not folded into a general restructuring of the military. Kept. Charles, who understood the nature of what Monk was actually asking, not a reward, but a continuation, agreed. On February 14, 1661, Monk's regiment was formally renamed. They became the Lord General's Regiment of Foot Guards. Later, they would be known by the name they still carry, the Coldstream Guards. The name came from the town in Scotland where they had been stationed before the march south. Coldstream, a small border town on the Tweed, unremarkable except for the fact that one of history's most consequential military movements had begun there on a cold January morning, when a general decided that the time had come to walk toward the problem without announcing what he intended to do about it. The regiment that was named for that town had a motto: Nulli secundus, second to none. It was not a boast about battles won or enemies defeated. It was something more specific than that and more lasting. It was a statement about institutional continuity, about showing up, about paying men on time and drilling at dawn and keeping the ledger balanced when everyone around you was burning theirs. Second to none. Not because they were the most decorated, not because they had fought the most famous battles, because they were the ones who had not broken. In the entire crisis of 1659 to 1660, as England lurched through dissolution and reconstitution and committee and coup and restoration, Monk's regiment had maintained a single unbroken line of institutional function. They were the thread that the country had not cut. And now they were the Guard. The Coldstream Guards were not the only regiment that would form the foundation of the modern household division. Charles II, restored and aware of exactly how fragile his position remained, moved quickly to establish a permanent military presence around the crown. He had spent 11 years in exile watching his father's monarchy dissolve, partly because it had no reliable standing force loyal to the person of the king, rather than to whichever political faction controlled Parliament that month. He was not going to make the same mistake. In 1660, he formally established the King's Life Guard of Horse Cavalry, drawn from the royalist officers who had followed him into exile and back. Men who had waited 11 years for this moment, who had sold their estates and their possessions and their futures on the belief that the king would return. They became the Life Guards. In 1661, the King's Regiment of Foot Guards was formed, soon to become the Grenadier Guards. They drew their lineage partly from the royalist forces, partly from the new military establishment Charles was building around a throne that was real again but not yet, by any means, secure. Around the same time, the King's Troop of Horse Grenadiers was established, a mounted unit whose function was as much ceremonial display of royal permanence as military protection. And underneath all of it, structurally, institutionally, in terms of unbroken continuity from the Republic through the Restoration and beyond, there were Monk's men. The ones who had never stopped. The ones whose pay ledger had no gaps. Charles understood what he had in the Coldstream Guards. He had the proof of concept. The demonstration that a regiment could survive political catastrophe intact if it was run with enough discipline, enough institutional loyalty, enough quiet refusal to be consumed by the noise around it. Every guard he built after that was built in the image of what Monk's regiment had already proven was possible. The Household Division, the collective name for the foot guards and the household cavalry, would grow over the following centuries into one of the most recognizable military institutions in the world. The bearskin hats, the red tunics, the immovable faces at the gates of Buckingham Palace. All of it grew from a pay ledger in Dalkeith. All of it grew from a man who refused to make a speech. There is one more thing. In the years after the Restoration, when Charles II had consolidated his position, and the crisis of the Republic had receded far enough to become history rather than memory, people would sometimes ask Monk about those months. About the march, about the letters, about the long silence while every faction in England tried to claim him. His answers were consistent in their brevity. He had not been waiting for the right moment to declare his intentions. He had not been playing factions against each other with the cunning of a chess player. He had not been secretly royalist all along, biding his time. He had been looking at England and seeing a country that could not function without a constitutional order that everyone accepted. He had been looking at the Republic and seeing a government that had lost the consent of the people it governed. He had been looking at the army and seeing institutions that had begun serving their own interests instead of the country's. And he had decided, with the pragmatism of a man who had spent his career managing the gap between ideal orders and practical realities, that the monarchy was the most available mechanism for restoring that order. Not because kings were divinely appointed. Not because Charles II was extraordinary. He was charming, politically shrewd, and personally dissolute, a combination that served him reasonably well on the throne, but was not exactly the portrait of sacred authority. Because continuity, in Monk's view, was the precondition for everything else. Justice, prosperity, reform, none of it was possible in a country that could not agree on who was in charge. He had restored the king, because the king was the answer to the question England had been failing to answer for 11 years. Who is in charge here? His regiment had already answered it. Every morning in Dalkeith, drilling at dawn, they had answered it. The person in charge is whoever shows up, pays their people, and holds the line. The rest is paperwork. The Coldstream Guards still exist. They have served in every major conflict Britain has fought since 1660. The Napoleonic Wars, the Crimea, the Boer War, both World Wars, the Falklands, Afghanistan. They still drill. They still guard the palaces and the towers and the ceremonial spaces where the crown makes itself visible to the people it represents. They are, by their own description, second to none. And if you stand outside Buckingham Palace on a grey London morning and watch the guard change, the precision of it, the absolute refusal of those faces to register the tourists or the cameras, or the noise of the city pressing against the gates, you are watching something that began not in ceremony but in stubbornness. A general who wouldn't make a speech. A regiment that wouldn't stop drilling. A pay ledger with no gaps. The British crown did not survive the 17th century because kings are powerful. It survived because one quiet soldier in a cold Scottish courtyard decided, with no particular drama and no recorded moment of revelation, that the institution was worth more than the chaos that would replace it. He held the line. Not with a declaration, not with a manifesto, with a morning drill. And then another one. And then another. Monk went back to his duties. He served as Captain General of the English forces under Charles II until his health failed in the early 1670s. He died in January 1670 at New Hall in Essex, surrounded by the kind of quiet that had always suited him better than ceremony. His regiment drilled the next morning. Same as always. The question this story leaves you with is a simple one. Every crisis produces men who make speeches and men who hold lines. The men who make speeches get the pamphlets and the portraits and the historical dramas. The men who hold lines get regimental mottos and clean ledgers and the kind of legacy that doesn't announce itself. George Monk never declared what he was going to do. He just did it. What would you have done in that Scottish courtyard, in the middle of a country tearing itself apart, when every powerful person in England was writing you letters, and all you had to offer them was a regiment that showed up? Would you have stayed quiet and held the line? Or would you have written the speech? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the loudest voice in the room is almost never the one that changes history. The men who change history are usually the ones outside, in the cold, running another drill before anyone else is awake. More stories are on your screen right now. Click one to keep watching, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, brand new story. Stay sharp, stay quiet, and never let noise win.